Fun fact, in addition to being the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia, Joe was also the first user of Palantir, right? Is that how you...
No, that's legitimately a true story. Yeah, this is I don't know how you haven't put this on your resume yet. Joe was the first outside of Palantir user of Palantir.
Great, great. Well, Trae, Joe gave a little bit on your background, but would love to add a little bit more color to that. You grew up in rural America, as we now know. You were a senior in high school when 9/11 happened, and you knocked down doors to get into Georgetown. Would love to just hear more about why you decided to go to Georgetown, end up in DC, just some of the early years in the intelligence community as well.
Sure. You know, I think one of the things that I took for granted as a hard-charging student in a rural public school is that it's actually really hard to get into college. I think I had assumed that as long as I have really good test scores and really good grades and good extracurriculars, it's just going to be like a clean path. And I basically got rejected everywhere that I applied. Incidentally, I did get into one school. It was UNC Chapel Hill, and my high school girlfriend had already planned to go to Elon, which is not too far away from UNC Chapel Hill. And I went over to her house that night and I was like devastated. I got all these skinny envelopes and I'm like, well, at least we're going to go to college close to each other. And she was like, yeah, about that. And broke up with me the same day that I got all these skinny envelopes. And you know, in retrospect, I can look back and it's clear that that was maybe the best thing that ever happened to me, because I'm like, I'm not going to UNC Chapel Hill. I'm going to go to the place that I want to go, and that's Georgetown. And so, yeah, I mean, Joe told the story accurately. I showed up and I demanded to see the Dean of Admissions, and I kind of dumped a bunch of recommendation letters on his table, and I think he thought I was crazy, but then ultimately they let me in. And it's kind of amazing that the way that the American academic culture works is that probably the most important decision for setting the framework for your career is a decision that we ask 18-year-olds to make. And there's like a tremendous amount of pressure. Like, what would have happened if I had gone the easy path and just said like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go to Ohio State because this is like a sure thing. I don't think I would be doing any of the things that I'm doing today. Not even that Ohio State's a bad school. It's just like, you're all here at Stanford. This is great. It's gonna be a great kind of launch pad for you in life. But like, you had to make that decision when you were 18 years old. That's crazy that we expect that of teenagers. So anyway.
When Paul and I were just awing on your story, it's really very much how government sales works as well, which is you got a bunch of no's and knock down some doors and
government relations from day one.
Get that, yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a good lesson, but yeah, no, it's true. It requires a lot of extra steps that you probably shouldn't have to go through.
Yeah, but we'll talk about your reinvention, down the line. So out of Georgetown, you go into the intelligence community, and then talk about how you got hooked up, with Palantir and kind of that interesting repivot.
Yeah,
you've been working IC for years.
Yeah, I saw a demo actually, and In-Q-Tel had already made an investment in Palantir, and they were kind of road showing it around the community. And I saw a demo and thought, wow, this would revolutionize my day-to-day. And tried to make this argument that this is the thing that we should do. And it turns out that there was very little institutional interest in licensing software from a Silicon Valley company. So just kind of ran into a bunch of roadblocks, started talking with the team at Palantir, which was only like 15 or 20 people. They had no revenue. I didn't know that at the time, but they had no revenue. And I ended up going and talking to them and said, I hope you're not wasting your time because this is going nowhere internally. Like, I've seen it from the inside, it's not going anywhere. And the guy at Palantir that I was talking to just kind of laughed, and he said, you probably think you're going to spend the rest of your career as a civil servant, but I'm gonna tell you right now, the attitude that you're showing, you're not gonna make it. You should really come out and join us. And so I spent one day in Palo Alto with the team, and went home and started talking to my wife, and she was like, I don't want to see you unhappy anymore. This seems like a much better path, and off to the races.
Talk about that, because I think the contrast between you and your wife's thinking around strategy and decision making. Talk about that. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, this is going to sound weird from like a multi-time entrepreneur and a venture capitalist, but I'm sort of risk averse. Not in like a actual risk aversion kind of way, more in like I'm highly analytical and I don't do impulsive decision making very well. My wife is the opposite. She's like ready to go on a moment's notice. And so, I'll come home with like this package of information, like, here's how I'm thinking about this. These are the pros and the cons. And she's like, the answer is obviously this. You should just go do it. And that's been important at every stage of my career. Like in every step, it was her kind of prodding me saying, don't stop dragging your feet. You have to like run through this door with a full head of steam. And that was true with not only Palantir, that transition from government over to Palantir was also true of Palantir to Founders Fund. I had no interest in venture capital. I didn't even know what venture capital was. My only exposure to it was in the movie Wedding Crashers, where they told people they were venture capitalists. That was my exposure to the word. And then also with starting Anduril, just having someone behind me, just like pushing me out the door, has been tremendously valuable.
What were the early days of Palantir like?
Oh man, it was a much slower start than people remember. The company was started in 2004, and when I joined in 2008, again, there was no revenue. It was like super, super early. So it took a long time to build. They had gone through like multiple iterations of product development to try to get it to like a minimally viable place to start shipping to the customers. It was a long, hard slog. Both Palantir and SpaceX had like roughly the same trajectory to their first $10 million in revenue. It was like over 5 years, which is pretty crazy if you think about from a startup perspective. Like that's like, dead zone. Like you can't go that long.
What would you do differently back on Palantir?
Man, I don't know. They didn't really have any shoulders to stand on. And so it wasn't like they could have run an Anduril strategy because the Anduril strategy in many ways relied on Palantir and SpaceX working before us. I think probably the biggest mistake that we made that was like tactical was we didn't hire lobbyists for a long time. And I think one of the core lessons from that experience is that you can't play the outsider game entirely. Like you have to have an inside baseball game that you run alongside of the outsider strategy. So that's probably the biggest thing.
So we get really personal here. We talk about the first day at Palantir, and you start coding.
Yeah.
So can we hit that highlight?
Yeah, so I was not a good software engineer. I was like maybe passable inside of the federal government, but then showing up on my first day at Palantir, I was like tinkering around, and they had like these exercises that they would run new hires through. And I was kind of dinking around, and one of the software engineers who I'd never met before walks up to the desk and he's like, "Hi, I'm such and such." I won't sell him out. We are recording this. He was like, "Hi, I'm such and such. Who are you?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm Trae. Today's my first day." And he was like, "You're a terrible software engineer. I'm blocking you from the code base." And so, like most software companies work, they were like, okay, Trae is a bad software engineer, but he's more extroverted than the rest of us. So he's now in charge of sales. And so that was kind of my path, is I ended up running what we called the leverage team. I don't know if any of you have like looked too deeply into Palantir, but historically the company has said that they don't have a sales team. And that was largely true, except that we had a team called Leverage that was basically the sales team. And that's what I was in charge of for the 6 years that I was there. And
then you joined Founders Fund. What prompted you to go?
Yeah, it was January 2014, so we're coming up on 10 years in January. I got a call from Peter Thiel, who is the co-founder, chairman of Palantir. And he and I worked together a lot because I was doing the strategic sales stuff, and he was always
the not engineering stuff.
The not engineering stuff. And so he called me out of the blue and said, "Hey, are you familiar with Founders Fund?" And I'm like, "I'm familiar with the venture fund that you started." And he was like, "Yeah, so we're about to raise this $1 billion institutional fund. It's the largest fund that we've ever run. And I really want to like build out our talent base, and I would love for you to like come join it." And I was like, "In what capacity?" Because like you're my boss at Palantir, so I'm still your employee. And he was like, no, I want you to like leave Palantir, move to San Francisco. I was in DC at the time. He's like, move to San Francisco and work at a venture fund full time. And I'm like, "Isn't that a finance job?" And he's like, "That's a finance job." I'm like, I don't know anything about finance. Like, what are we talking about here? So it was completely out of the blue. And he just kind of kept up over 9 months. The call was in March of 2013. And he just kept poking me all the way through 2013. And then right at the end of the year, he was like, "You got to do this. It's the right decision. It's going to make everyone happy." So I left. And
then you talked to your wife.
Then I talked to my wife, and my wife was like, yeah, this is obviously what you should do. So it was one of those weird moments where I'm like stepping into the unknown, like into
So
a
now
totally
you're reinventing yourself as a venture capitalist, right? So talk about the first couple of years. What'd you do?
Yeah.
Kind of interesting.
Well, I mean, because I didn't know anything about venture, I didn't feel like I was in a good position to like, just outbound to like enterprise SaaS companies. I didn't feel like I really had anything to offer there. So I did two things. The first thing is that I told everyone on the team that I wanted to join their pitch meetings. Because it turns out that the best way to learn how to be good at venture capital is by osmosis. You just have to take an enormous amount of pitch meetings, and the quality almost doesn't matter. It's like you want to just like any inbound, like people would just forward it to me and I would take the meeting. It didn't matter how stupid it was. And I did that for an entire year, and I crossed 500 meetings in my first year, which, there's 365.
And these weren't Zooms, these were like in-person
These were in-person meetings.
Real meetings.
Yeah, and so it might not sound like a huge number, but like 500 is an enormous amount of pitch meetings for 1 year in VC. And so I hit, I think 502. And I told the team at the end of the year, I'm like, I did it, 502 meetings. And they're like, what were you doing? That is a terrible idea. I'm like, yeah, you're right. It was a pretty dumb idea. But ended up making two big investments that year. One in Flexport, which is now a $9 billion valuation supply chain logistics company. And the other in a company called Expanse.
Yeah,
it used to be called Cadium, which was acquired by Palantir Networks for $1 billion. So
You're 2 for 2 on your first
two for two in my first year, which I don't honestly have any idea how that happened. But then I also was running this strategy on national security, which is I guess what brings us here today. So recognizing that the one area that I had some edge in, and by edge I mean I have some secret or some advantage against the rest of the venture capital market, was defense tech, because that's where I'd spent my entire career. And so I luckily had access to two different databases. One is FedBizOps, so all of the people, all the companies that are bidding on federal contracts, and then also PitchBook or PitchBook equivalents, which is basically like a database of all venture-backed technology companies. And I just started running cross postings on them, pull down all the people bidding on contracts, check to see if they've raised venture capital, outbound to the founders to try to get a meeting. And the idea was, maybe there's another Palantir and SpaceX out there, and Founders Fund is one of the largest institutional investors in both of those companies. So maybe we have an edge, we can find the next one, and it's going to be massive and successful. Other than Expanse, I didn't find anything. I just kind of came up short. And even in retrospect, almost 10 years later, it's not like we missed anything. There wasn't a company that came out that had that sort of scaling. And going through meeting these, literally over 100 companies, I kind of came to the realization that a lot of the things that were really hard at Palantir were related to selling software being really hard, and we can talk about why I think that is. It was, the team construction mattered a lot of really bad strategies that companies had employed that was advice that they were getting from consultants and other things that just didn't map at all to the success model that Palantir and SpaceX have worked out. And so I went back to the team in, this was 2015, it was July, I think, of 2015. And I said, guys, this company doesn't exist, but what we really need is a Stark Industries from Iron Man. We need a 21st century defense prime that builds across the product suite, is focused on platforms, winning big core things that are going to be funded for decades at a time. And the core capability has to be software, because all the things we actually need are software capabilities, but you can't sell software. So somebody needs to Trojan horse wrap the software in different shapes of metal and then sell that metal to the DoD. And to my surprise, Peter and the rest of the team, they were like, okay, well, it sounds like you know what to do. Go start a company. I'm like, Peter, I'm so freaking confused. You're like, you don't want me doing Palantir, you want me doing finance. Now you don't want me doing finance, you want me to do, Anduril is like, no, you can do both. Everybody's happy.
So what were the early days like in terms of how did you recruit the team? How did Anduril come together?
Yeah, I mean,
lean startup,
Totally, yeah. I mean, this is a lot of lessons from people like Steve and Joe. If you haven't watched Steve's Secret History of Silicon Valley, I would recommend that you do it. I actually watched that video on that same first day at Palantir where I got told that I wasn't allowed to write code anymore. I watched his video, The Secret History of Silicon Valley. And these concepts around lean startup really were like played out in the way that we built Anduril. It was like a lot of guessing and testing. The first thing that I had to do, obviously, was recruit a co-founding team. And so I went out to my closest friends that I had worked with before, which this is a great hack, by the way. One of the core problems that you'll see in most startups is co-founder drama, like conflict between the founding members of the team. If you start the company with people that you have, a decade plus relationship with, the probability of that happening is much lower. And so I went out to Palmer. We were the first institutional investor in Oculus. I knew he was really interested in national security. Started pitching him on this idea of a 21st century defense prime, and he was like, "Oh, you have to come out to my house in Woodside. I'm building a ramjet in my swimming pool." And sure enough, he had drained his swimming pool, and he was building a ramjet in his swimming pool.
As everyone in Salt Lake
As everyone,
does.
and he was like, "Yeah, I've had a couple of noise violations. Cops have come out." I'm like, "Yeah, because you have a ramjet in your swimming pool in Woodside. That's going to happen." And then the guy who was running engineering at Palantir, Brian Schimpf, he was the hardest sell, actually. He was not convinced.
How long did that take?
It took, I started talking to him probably in late 2016, like call it October, November of 2016, and he didn't sign on until I think May of 2017. Yeah. The first day of the company was June 5th, 2017. So it was like a 6-month sale. And then Matt Grimm, who ran commercial for Palantir, brilliant guy, but maybe more importantly, he's like the incredible freaking Hulk. Like he's just a rage monster, and probably the best operator I've ever worked with in my life. Like you send him something, you're like, "Hey, can you take a look at this?" And then like it's done, like 5 minutes later, and you're like, "I don't even know how you did that. I'm not gonna ask questions. I'm just glad that it's done." And then Joe Chen, who was very early with Palmer at Oculus, and was also a reserve officer in the Army.
And what did you do differently in building Anduril versus Palantir's early days?
We literally hired a lobbyist in the first week of the company. So we started the company on a Monday, the anniversary of D-Day. And then on that Wednesday, me, Palmer, and Brian had a meeting with government officials who ended up being our first customers. Literally like 3 days into the company, we met with our first customers who now have a multi-$100 million program of record with us. And then on the 5th day, that Friday, we were meeting with members of Congress. This is like 1 week. So we basically just accelerated the strategy by not doing all of the stupid stuff that I did in the 6 years at Palantir. Sometimes other defense founders will come to me asking for advice on things, and they'll be like, "Oh, we've been talking to all these consultants, we've been talking to all these like retired generals, and they have all these ideas of things that we should be doing, and your advice is totally different. Like, how did you come to that?" And I'm like, "Because I did literally all of the things that the consultants told you to do, and none of them work. Like, I made all of these mistakes." And so we just shortcutted all that by like not doing all the things that I knew didn't work.
And I just want to context it. This is 2017, right? So this is when like national security is not a hot topic. There were not a lot of VCs. When we invested in the seed round, you had to teach us about just war theory and deterrence. Right. So I do think, let's just talk about the ethics of defense. This is a topic you blog about. I think now it's a lot more understood, but back then it was not. And
right.
Just kind of walk through that arc and the importance of it.
Yeah, I mean, there is 2,000 years of scholarship on this topic. It's not like a new thing. I think in moments of high political volatility, people tend to forget about it, and they're like mostly just responding emotionally to like circumstances in the moment. But just war theory is not about any interest in conducting violence. That's not what any of this is about. There's like, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, so I'm going to be a super Star Wars nerd. But Yoda makes this very clear when he says, "War does not make one great." And I think that is like the unifying theory of all Western democracies when it comes to defense. In fact, in our not so distant past, the Department of Defense used to be called the Department of War. But we changed that because that's not what any of us want. We're not optimizing for war. And it doesn't matter which political party is in control of the White House. It is by far the most bipartisan department in the federal government. The National Defense Authorization Act is one of the only bills that passes every single year with a supermajority through Congress. Everyone understands that defense and deterrence is really important to not only the national security and our ability to do the things that we do every day, but it's also important to economic resiliency. It's important to supply chain. It's important to the promotion of human rights, civil rights globally. And so we get hung up on this idea that like, oh, you're building a missile, you're building something that has like lethality attached to it. But really, and I don't want to like put any of that aside because that's very real. And it is like potentially very scary to think about what some of these things can do. At the same time, the goal is not to use those weapons. The goal is to leverage the advantage that those technologies give you to deter conflict from happening in the first place. And just war theory talks about this in a variety of different ways. It talks about it with just cause. Do you have the information that you need to make effective decisions to prevent the unnecessary loss of life? This is when it comes to like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Are you powering the engine that fuels just cause? It comes to proportionality. When someone attacks you, are you attacking them with a massive response in retaliation that outweighs the attack that they made against you? It comes to the principle of discrimination, like how careful and precise are you being with your attack? One way to think about this in modern warfare is that we started, at the beginning of human civilization, like punching each other, right? And then it was like, then we use rocks, and then we use swords, and like it got more and more violent, and we went from like swords to explosives, and then like the atomic bomb. And then humanity kind of across the board realized, wow, this is really crazy. Like we could literally eradicate extinct human civilization. And since then, we've been crawling our way back down the curve. Weapons have become much more precise. Casualties have ramped way down in every conflict that we've had. And the goal of the principle of discrimination is how accurate can we become? Can we become so accurate that we can only take out the exact targets that we're interested in taking out? And in doing so, create a deterrent impact so that larger conflict doesn't break out and casualties won't be caused. And one like really clear example of this is the Zawahiri takedown, which happened in 2021, I want to say, September of 2021. If any of you followed this closely, he was taken out with a what's called a Ginsu AIM-9, literally non-explosive. It's just a missile that spins, and it took out only him. It hit the roof, took out him, no collateral. The building is still standing. It didn't even blow up the building. And these sorts of like highly precise attacks are the future of a more just execution of strategy, not a less just execution of strategy. And that's really what we're focused on at Anduril is autonomy, precision, taking the men and women who are protecting our country out of harm's way.
And how do you think about religion as well? I know that's something that's a big part of what defines you as well.
You have the three Silicon Valley no-nos: defense, government, and religion. It's kind of...
Yeah, and Peter takes the contrarian thing very seriously and has boxed me in pretty tight. I have always loved philosophy and theology, and I think I've like come to this place in my career where the connection of the things that I personally hold very dear, particularly on the theological side, find their way bleeding into the stuff that I'm most interested in. And I think that, just war theory, for what it's worth, was originated by St. Augustine. It's a Christian tradition that's now part of the entire Western canon for the way that we think about violence. And I think that taking that and thinking through moral code and natural right and where we establish the ethics for how we engage with one another, not only in a defense context, but also civically, is a really important exercise just to make sure that we have like a foundational truth that we're checking back to and not just like cascading into nihilism. Because if you're cascading into nihilism, you have no foundational truth, no natural right that you're holding up. Then you're really only operating on the highest ideals of a society. And I think it would be very easy to look at like the Russian perspective on Ukraine and say they're operating inside the highest ideals of their society. Do we believe that they have a natural right to execute the highest ideals of their society, or do we believe that there are governors that need to be put on that to ensure justice for people around the world? And I would argue, yes, there is a natural right, and we are not responsible to like be the international police of that, but we are at least responsible for speaking truth into those things.
Mm-hmm. Opportunities ahead. What are you thinking for this sector?
Yeah, oh man, it's really hard. I think there's a big difference between the defense technology space and like enterprise SaaS 10 years ago. A lot of the most talented people in the technology ecosystem behave in a similar way to like George Clooney and the Kardashians. I'll explain why. George Clooney says, I have a huge name, I have a great brand, my organic advantage in distribution is very, very high. So I'm gonna start a tequila brand or whatever he sells. I think it's tequila, right? Casamigos. And that's great for him because his customer acquisition cost is incredibly low because he's George freaking Clooney. And that's great. He can just like print money. Same thing with the Kardashians. It's like they pick a commodity thing, they go and they print money in that commodity on the back of their low customer acquisition cost. I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley that are super talented, have a big brand, they're doing the most logical thing. They're starting enterprise SaaS companies. They're like, I can do this. It's going to be really easy. The tech barrier is really low. I have an advantage in distribution. I'm just going to kick everybody's butt and I'm going to make a ton of money. I would call that like a pretty bad quest. We need our best people to be focused on the most important things, not the least important things. The challenge is that defense tech is really, really hard. It's not only really, really hard from a tech perspective, it's really, really hard from a distribution perspective. And it requires a lot of capital. It requires a lot of know-how. It requires a lot of relationships. And so I always love seeing young people that are like super passionate about this, like go out and start companies. The challenge is like you need some more heft. You can't just go and like YOLO, a Field of Dreams defense tech company. If you build it, they will not come. That's not how it works. You need to actually know what you're doing. And so my hopes and dreams for the sector. It's great to see that there's so much more interest now than there was in 2017. I think there's like more of an awareness in the most talented people in the world that we have not reached the end of history. There are still bad people that are doing bad things, and we have to have some sort of control over that in the international geopolitical scene. I think people are also realizing that this isn't a zero interest, free money factory anymore. You can't just like, run out and start a blockchain company and expect that you're going to make $1 trillion next week. SBF is in jail now. That didn't work. And so I think that people are starting to come back to this idea like they want to work on important things. And so that's really good to see. I think it's just really important to like think through what are the things that you need to be able to pull off in order to like build a successful company. And as a result, I would encourage people that want to work in this space to maybe go and spend some time at a SpaceX, a Palantir, an Anduril, a Shield AI, something like that.
Government stuff.
Government stuff. Go and get a sense for innovation labs. Go get a sense for like how this stuff works, so that you're not just like This
is not the founder vibe. Talk about that.
Yeah, Stanford. You guys are way more responsible for this than any other college, from what I can tell. There's like a vibes founder thing going on where it's like, another way of putting this is like a whiteboard founder. It's like the only thing you know for sure is that you want to be a founder, but you don't know what you want to found. You just really want to be a founder for the vibes, Like I want to go to Y Combinator alumni events. Like the vibes, guys, the vibes. The problem is that the vibes of being a founder of a bad company is way worse than the vibes of being an important player at a company that's working, where you're learning and building your career. You don't have to found something at 30 years old. In fact, the Anduril story was not that. We were all like way later in our career. I mean, not Palmer, but Palmer also was a billionaire by the time he was 20 or whatever. It's like, that doesn't really count. You can pursue that dream, but Oculus as a consumer product is very different than building a defense company. Palmer couldn't have done that as a 19-year-old. I don't think he would claim that either. I think being more mindful of like picking up the skills that you need to pick up to go and chase the thing that you're really passionate about rather than just like doing it for the vibes.
Yeah, and the whiteboard founder, just to use your words, is like where you put a bunch of ideas on the whiteboard and pick the best one, the best relative idea, and that's kind of your idea.
Yeah.
Talk about like talent, the Superman versus X-Men analogy as well.
This is one of the greatest lessons I learned at Palantir was from Shyam Sankar, who is the CTO now, I think. He's changed roles a few times. Shyam would use this analogy of the X-Men. He would say that, the worst thing that you can do is something that you're not good at. And a lot of times in a liberal arts educational tradition in particular, you're like, I want to grow, man. Like I want to go and learn how to do all these things that I'm not good at, and I'm going to level up and be better at those things. And the reality is that usually what happens is people can level up into not sucking, but not being excellent. And then they're going to have this edge of superpowers that they're just way better than everybody else at. If you think about the way the X-Men conduct their activities in every single comic book, every movie, is that it requires all of them working together to accomplish a mission. It's you need Cyclops with his laser beam eyes, you need Storm conjuring the weather, you need Wolverine with adamantium claws, and if any one of them wasn't there, something was probably gonna go wrong. But for some reason, we don't think about that in professional career very much because we're you wanna be well-rounded. Well-rounded is nonsense. We don't need to be well-rounded. We need to be superpower at the thing that we're superpower at and let other people have their superpowers and execute along those lines. And Palantir was the first place I had ever been that had this as a core part of the strategy. I'm not writing code. I'm out talking to customers. And the guy who told me to not write code, he was not talking to customers. Definitely not talking to customers. And that's okay. And I think that's a good lesson for us all to kind of take with us day to day.
Great. This is such useful insights. This is a great time to bring Steve Blank on stage.
Just looking at all of you, you either are here because you think Trae's going to write some checks for you when you corner him, and maybe that's true, or more importantly, some of you were really interested in national security and what you could give back to the country. And I think that's incredibly important here in Silicon Valley. But Trae, just wrapping up, listening to, first of all, how you got into Georgetown, I think kind of embodies something we should just remind the students is that for an entrepreneur, no is just the beginning of the conversation. It's a big idea, right? For most everybody else, and I don't mean in a social setting, I mean in at Stanford, we have to be careful, right? No, I mean in a business setting. Don't you notice that in your portfolio, that the world-class entrepreneurs, no just is the start?
I would actually, not only do I agree with that, I think the next step of that is probably equally, if not more important, which is that the worst entrepreneurs are the ones that they hear no and they immediately become a victim.
Right.
They immediately are like, this VC doesn't get it. This, customer doesn't get it. They're not smart enough to understand why what I'm doing is revolutionizing.
Well, it might be true, but they don't give up.
If you approach it from the reason this was no is because I didn't do something and now I have to go and do another thing. I have to tell the story better. I have to get better at fundraising. I have to make a better pitch deck. I have to build a better model. I have to go and talk to more members of Congress. I have to go and meet with other customers. I have to figure out why my product isn't sufficient. Avoiding that victim mentality is the unlock.
And for those of you thinking about being part of a startup or founding one, this idea of relentless and tenacious forward motion, I think, is just embodied in what we heard from Trae's career. The second part, which is, I can't even think of a class at Stanford that teaches this, but you ought to resonate on the word lobbying. We think here in the Valley, the best product wins. And for those of you who haven't seen or know who Bill Gurley is, he just, from Benchmark, just did a great talk on surprised about, oh gosh, the game is rigged in Washington and it's a really miserable thing. Anybody ever see the movie Casablanca? There's a scene there where people go up to this police commander who's shutting this bar down for gambling, and just as he's saying that, someone comes up to them and says, "Sir, your winnings?" So my point is, Bill was seemingly surprised that the game is rigged. Well, what do you think lobbyists do? and this is not only for defense, but for any business that you're thinking of starting that has a regulatory component, if you don't hire a lobbyist on day one, and this is not what VCs are skilled at in Silicon Valley in general, you're going to be like the ex-founder in X company or surprised every time some incumbent has gamed the system because they own either they've captured what's called regulatory capture, or they basically own all the contracts. Does that make sense at all? I would just want to double and triple down on that. And then just to kind of wrap up, implicit in everything that Trae said but didn't say, there's a really interesting time that's going on here. And there's 2 or 3 major changes that just have happened to the U.S. Department of Defense. One is, for the last 75 years, the U.S. government, meaning their own federal research labs, their prime contractors, et cetera, all owned the most advanced weapons and most advanced technology. They owned it. We had the best technology. We owned it. And therefore, it showed up in weapon systems, defensive stuff, offensive stuff. That's no longer true. It's a big idea. The U.S. government no longer owns the most advanced technology. Some of the things, thank goodness, we still own, like nuclear weapons or hypersonics. And if it's up to Elon Musk, he'd probably own both of those as well. But thank goodness he doesn't. But, you know, Elon makes more satellites than all the prime contractors ever put together. You know, wireless technology, drone technology, et cetera, no longer owned by governments. And that is both good news and bad news, because not only is that no longer owned by the government, some of it is available right off the shelf. Go see Ukraine about people who are just buying drones and modifying them. The other observation is that the Department of Defense has not figured that out. They kind of say the words, but their organization is still designed not to buy from commercial companies and startups. And so there's this impedance match that companies that, like Anduril and certainly like SpaceX and Palantir, had to pioneer by beating the Department of Defense with a stick and saying your organization that's designed to historically deal with your internal resources no longer match what we need. That's idea one. Implicit idea number 2 is, for the first time again in the history of the United States, we're dealing with a potential, and hopefully not, but a potential adversary that has more people, more technology, more dollars put on the problem than the U.S. does. And in fact, our goal is to deter a potential war in the South China Sea. Not to win one, but win one if we have to, but deter one. And boy, that tends to sharpen the mind. With all of a sudden, people in our Department of Defense realize we no longer own all the key technologies. There are commercial startups that might actually have something that they could bring to the fight, and there's a time element that's ticking down. And so that's potentially changing how the Department of Defense thinks about commercial technology and national security, and it's been pioneered by Founders Fund, General Catalyst, Brave, et cetera. We're all trying to get people to think about maybe we should reorganize the way we do this. The third part is all of you. You know, Joe Felter and I started a class here at Stanford 8 years ago called Hacking for Defense. And we weren't even sure that we'd get any students engaged in national security, because back then it was, let's go to work for Facebook or Google, et cetera. That class is now in 60 universities in 3 countries in the United States, graduated thousands of students who are now kind of either affiliated or working with the Department of Defense or the intelligence community. Most of them have gone off to commercial companies, but now they understand the nature of national security. And so for all of you, I just kind of think that you should maybe think about your career in context of Trae's career, that you could start as a technologist, but you can actually end up and helping the country think about how to make it safer and secure, and at the same time, you know, do a startup and make some money. And that's a really interesting combination that didn't exist before these sea changes that are going on in national security. So Ernestine, I think that, and Paul, that would be my wrap up.
Thank you, and thank you, Trae, for coming.
Thanks, Trae.
Sure.